They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, it was a federal prison sentence. I thought refusing to sign away 50% of my hard-earned home was just another dinner table argument. I was wrong. When the greed of your own flesh and blood crosses into felony territory, you are left with exactly one choice. You burn their entire empire down, even if it means watching your parents stand before a judge in handcuffs. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. We are so grateful for your continued support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and keep creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the PayPal link in the video description or pinned comment. My name is Andrea Carpenter. I am 32 years old, and I work as a data security architecture specialist at Apex Vault Data Security located in Denver, Colorado. My daily professional life is a relentless battlefield of codes, firewalls, and encryption protocols. My core responsibility is protecting the financial systems and personal identities of millions of innocent people from highly sophisticated, devastating cyber attacks. It is an intensely demanding career that requires a forensic level of attention to detail and a strictly logical mindset. I thrive in the shadows of the servers, silently keeping the digital infrastructure of our society safe without ever asking for a spotlight. My brother, Julian, operates in a completely different universe. At 35 years old, he has always been the undeniable golden child of our family. Julian is a flashy, hyper-visible social media influencer who has built a massive online following by constantly flaunting a lavish, albeit heavily filtered, lifestyle. He aggressively brands himself as a digital real estate investment guru, while I spend my days writing complex security algorithms to stop real-world criminals. He spends his days posting perfectly staged photos of rented Italian sports cars, designer watches, and VIP club tables, to anyone with a critical eye. His wealth always seemed hollow, a carefully constructed illusion built on buzzwords and empty promises. The stark, agonizing contrast between our two worlds was never more painfully obvious than during our mandatory monthly family dinners. These gatherings were always a suffocating ritual of psychological endurance for me. My parents, Margaret and Thomas, would spend the entire evening fawning over Julian as if he were a deity descended from the heavens. They praised his so-called entrepreneurial spirit and business acumen endlessly. Meanwhile, they actively dismissed, belittled, and mocked my career. Just that very morning, my team and I had successfully thwarted a massive ransomware attack aimed directly at the city emergency response system. We had literally saved hospitals from losing access to critical patient data. Yet, when I quietly tried to share this victory over the dinner table, my mother practically waved her hand in my face to shut me up. That sounds very dry and tedious. Andrea, my mother said, not even looking up from her plate of roast beef. Are you sure staring at computer screens in a dark room all day is good for your mental health? You really should learn a thing or two from Julian. He is out there making real waves, building a tangible empire, and networking with important people. Exactly right, my father chimed in, proudly raising his glass of wine toward my brother. To Julian, the true visionary of the Carpenter family. Julian simply soaked up the unearned praise, flashing a perfectly whitened, arrogant smile. But that particular dinner was not just about stroking his fragile ego. As I would soon discover, there was a sickening, calculated agenda hidden beneath the compliments. As dessert was served and the plates were cleared, the atmosphere in the dining room noticeably shifted. My mother cleared her throat, suddenly wearing a serious, strictly business expression. Andrea, we need to discuss your house, she announced abruptly. I stiffened. I had just finished a grueling, immensely expensive, multi-year restoration of a beautiful historic home in the Denver suburbs. Through rigorous financial discipline, I had also recently paid off the final mortgage installment. The house was my absolute sanctuary, It was a physical manifestation of my independence, built entirely on my own sweat, stress, and hard-earned savings. Julian is launching a massive new investment project next month, my father said, leaning forward heavily on the table. A real super project that will double his portfolio, but his liquid assets are currently tied up in the digital space. He needs physical collateral to secure the final round of traditional banking funding. And that is exactly where you come in, sweetheart, my mother continued, her tone sickeningly sweet, yet laced with command. We have decided that you are going to sign over 50% ownership of your house to Julian. It is the perfect, most logical solution. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the three of them in absolute, unadulterated disbelief. Excuse me, you want me to just give away half of my home? I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. Do not be so dramatic, my mother sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were a petulant child throwing a tantrum. You are just a single woman living entirely alone. You are a total bookworm. Andrea, you do not need to hold on to that much physical property. It is selfish. Your brother is building a lasting legacy. He desperately needs this collateral to grow. I felt the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. My parents were not politely asking for a favor. They were blatantly demanding the fruits of my grueling labor to subsidize my brother's smoke and mirrors lifestyle. They viewed my success not as an achievement, but as an available resource for their golden child to plunder. Absolutely not, I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm, resolute whisper. My property is not a family charity fund. I worked 80-hour weeks to pay for this house. I bled for this house. Julian gets absolutely nothing from me. The silence that immediately followed my refusal was deafening and highly volatile. My father violently slammed his fist onto the solid wood dining table. His face flushed red with extreme anger. He stood up, towering over me, and viciously called me a selfish, scheming, and utterly ungrateful daughter who refused to support her own blood in a time of need. My mother instantly burst into loud, theatrical tears, wailing hysterically about how my cold heart was tearing our precious family apart over mere money. But amidst the chaotic screaming and crying, it was Julian's reaction that truly chilled me to the bone. He did not yell. He did not argue or beg. As my parents eventually grabbed their coats and stormed out of my dining room in a self-righteous rage, Julian lingered by the front door for a brief moment. He turned back, looked me dead in the eye, and gave a slow, shady half-smile that sent shivers down my spine. It was not a look of defeat or disappointment. It was the calculated look of a predator who had already found a back door into a secure system. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, a dark premonition settled heavily into my chest. The argument was over, but the real storm was just beginning. Exactly 1 month after that disastrous dinner, the suffocating silence from my family was broken not by an apology, but by a thick manila envelope delivered via certified mail. The return address belonged to a prominent commercial real estate appraisal firm operating out of downtown Denver. I ripped open the seal while standing in my kitchen, expecting some routine municipal zoning notice or perhaps an updated property tax assessment. Instead, I found myself staring at a finalized disbursement notification. According to the heavily stamped, legally binding documents shaking in my trembling hands, a brand new mortgage loan in the exact amount of $400,000 had just been approved and fully funded. The collateral listed for this massive sum of money was the deed to my very own home. My vision blurred, the edges of the room spinning violently, but the sheer panic only lasted for a fraction of a second before my professional instincts violently took over. I sprinted to my home office, locked the heavy oak door, and fired up my multi-monitor workstation. Tapping into the secure, highly encrypted network protocols I use daily at Apex Vault Data Security, I bypassed the painfully slow public web portals and directly queried the county clerk digital archives. I needed to see the underlying paperwork that authorized this catastrophic financial transaction. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard in a blur of keystrokes. executing advanced search queries and retrieving the raw file packets within minutes. What I found hidden within those digital records made my stomach violently churn. There, digitized in high resolution on my center screen, was a comprehensive general power of attorney document, entirely transferring my financial and real estate decision rights to my brother. Attached to it was a notarized quitclaim deed. Both documents bore a flawless digital replication of my personal signature, authenticated by a remote online notary service I had never heard of in my entire life. It was not a sloppy forgery. It was a perfectly executed, highly sophisticated case of identity theft and property fraud, designed to bypass standard banking security checks. I snatched my phone from the desk and dialed Julian. He answered on the second ring, the loud, pulsing bass of electronic club music booming in the background, contrasting sharply with the dead silence of my office. "Well, hello there, little sister," Julian shouted over the ambient noise, his voice dripping with relaxed, sickening amusement. "Did you finally get the mail?" "You forged my signature, Julian," I said, my voice completely devoid of any inflection, dropping into a cold, clinical register. "You stole $400,000 against my property. That is a federal crime." Julian let out a loud, theatrical laugh that echoed through the receiver. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. Andrea, I did not steal anything. I simply utilized a highly creative legal maneuver. Mom and Dad totally agreed it was the only logical way to bypass your ridiculous stubbornness. The money is already in motion for my new project. The ship has officially sailed. Andrea, the ink is dry and the funds are cleared. You cannot undo it. If you have any sense of loyalty, you will just quietly accept this minor inconvenience for the greater good of the family. We all rise together." He hung up the phone before I could formulate a reply, leaving me listening to the sterile dial tone. My lungs burned as I immediately dialed my parents' home landline. I desperately needed to believe that Julian was lying about their involvement, that he had somehow conned them too, spinning some elaborate web of lies to get their blessing. My father picked up the receiver after the fourth ring. "Dad, Julian just committed massive mortgage fraud," I gasped out, the words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "He forged a power of attorney document to take out a loan on my house. You have to tell me you did not know about this scheme." "Do not you dare use that accusatory tone with me," my father barked, his voice vibrating with instant, defensive rage. "Your brother desperately needed leverage and you were being incredibly selfish. You refused to help him when you had more than enough equity just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. We did what had to be done to ensure his success. You are a calculating, ungrateful child who does not understand the basic meaning of sacrifice." The line went abruptly dead. The silence that rushed back into my office was absolute and utterly deafening. In that exact moment, the final, fragile thread of my familial love snapped completely in half. The realization crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. My parents were not simply covering up for a wayward son. They were active, willing accomplices in the deliberate theft of my life savings. They had weaponized my own success against me. Most people would have completely broken down, screamed into a pillow until their vocal cords tore, or impulsively called the local police department in a blind, tearful rage. I did none of those things. I took one deep, stabilizing breath and deliberately froze every single emotion in my body, locking the grief and shock away in a mental vault. Calling the local police would be a massive tactical error. A beat cop would look at a family dispute involving real estate and tell us it was a messy civil matter to be sorted out in mediation. I could not afford to let them see me coming. I needed to go nuclear. I pulled up a highly secure, encrypted browser, completely bypassing all standard search engines to ensure my digital footprint remained invisible. I initiated a targeted proxy search for a ruthless, high-power attorney specializing strictly in white-collar financial crimes and corporate fraud. As the encrypted contact page loaded on my screen, I reached down and manually powered on my secondary, military-grade server rack. The gentle hum of the cooling fans filled the room. I was no longer a daughter or a sister. I was an architect of data security, and my family had just declared war on my fortress. It was time to hunt them down. The screen of my primary monitor cast a harsh, blue glow across the darkened room as the clock struck 3 in the morning. I was no longer operating as a grieving daughter or a betrayed sister. I was functioning entirely as a forensic data architect on a mission to completely dismantle a hostile threat. My first and most critical objective was tracking the freshly minted $400,000. Money of that massive magnitude never simply vanishes into thin air. It always leaves a heavy digital footprint, a structural trail of breadcrumbs that someone with my exact, highly specialized skill set can easily trace. I started with the disbursement routing numbers printed on the fraudulent mortgage paperwork. Using advanced packet sniffing scripts I had custom built for my security work at Apex Vault, I breached the superficial layers of Julian's corporate banking architecture. The $400,000 had initially landed in a primary business checking account registered right here in Denver, but it only sat there for exactly 14 hours. From there, the capital was aggressively fractured. Julian had split the massive sum into 8 separate wire transfers of $50,000 each, funneling them rapidly through a dizzying maze of anonymous shell companies incorporated in the Cayman Islands and Belize. It was a classic, textbook layering technique utilized by white-collar criminals to obscure the final destination of stolen assets. But Julian was a vain social media influencer, not a master hacker. He was incredibly sloppy with his operational security. He used the exact same virtual private network node for multiple offshore transactions, and I easily cracked his encrypted tunnel. When I finally pulled the curtain back on his final holding accounts, the glamorous facade of his digital real estate empire shattered into a million pathetic pieces. There was no super project. There were no commercial property acquisitions or high-yield digital asset portfolios. Julian's entire business model was a massive, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. Digging deeply into his hidden client ledgers, I felt a profound wave of disgust wash over me. His primary targets were not wealthy venture capitalists or savvy tech investors. He deliberately and maliciously preyed upon the vulnerable. His investor list was comprised almost entirely of lonely, elderly individuals residing in neighboring states like Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. These were people over the age of 65 who had eagerly handed over their entire life savings, their dead spouses' life insurance policies, and their retirement pensions because a charming, well-dressed young man on the internet promised them a guaranteed return of 15% annually. He was taking the fresh capital from the newest elderly victims to pay fake dividends to the older investors, skimming an enormous percentage off the top to fund his rented Italian sports cars, luxury watches, and VIP club tables. However, the fraudulent pyramid was rapidly collapsing. A private forum of his earliest, largest investors had finally realized their requested financial withdrawals were being repeatedly delayed or ignored. They had banded together, hired a vicious corporate litigation firm, and were officially threatening to drag Julian into federal court by the end of the month if they did not receive their initial capital back immediately. The financial hole in Julian's books was colossal, and he needed a huge, immediate injection of untraceable cash to pay off the angry mob and prevent a catastrophic legal discovery process. My hard-earned house was never meant to be collateral for a visionary expansion. It was a desperate, bleeding tourniquet applied to a fatal financial wound. Yet, the absolute most chilling discovery was still waiting for me in the digital shadows. I turned my analytical attention back to the remote online notary who had verified my forged signature on the property deed. The notary profile was registered to a fictitious shell corporation, but the digital registration fees had to be paid by a real, verifiable entity. I ran a deep forensic trace on the credit card transaction used to purchase the fraudulent notary software license. The billing IP address pinged back to a very familiar location. It was my parents' house. My hands hovered frozen over the mechanical keyboard. I ran the trace a second time, and then a third time. The result remained identical. Pushing deeper into the network, I utilized a secure backdoor access point I had installed on my parents' home router 2 years ago to help them with remote tech support. I slipped silently and invisibly into my mother's personal online banking portal. There, buried under weeks of mundane grocery and utility transactions, was a glaring, undeniable deposit. Exactly 2 days after my stolen mortgage funds had officially cleared the bank, a wire transfer originating from one of Julian's offshore shell accounts had landed directly in my parents' joint checking account. The amount was exactly $50,000. The transaction reference line simply read as a consulting bonus. They had not just given Julian their blind blessing out of some twisted sense of parental loyalty, they had actively facilitated the forgery, provided the logistical digital cover, and taken a massive, tangible cut of the stolen money. My own mother and father had literally sold my financial security for $50,000. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly dark, that it completely severed the last remaining emotional nerve I possessed. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply felt an icy, terrifying, and highly focused calm wash over my entire being. I spent the next 48 hours doing exactly what I do best. I became an absolute ghost in the machine. I systematically downloaded every single piece of damning evidence. I captured the offshore routing numbers, the complete list of the defrauded elderly victims, the fake digital contracts, the IP address logs linking the forgery to my parents' living room, and the detailed banking records proving the $50,000 kickback. I even included the recorded audio of Julian cheerfully admitting to the legal maneuver on our phone call. I compiled this massive mountain of irrefutable data into a single, comprehensive digital dossier. I sealed the folder using military-grade, 256-bit advanced encryption standards. No state-level detective was going to touch this case. A local police precinct would get instantly bogged down in the jurisdictional nightmare of offshore accounts and wire fraud. This was a massive, multi-state conspiracy involving identity theft, severe elder abuse, and millions of dollars in illicit financial transfers. I bypassed the local authorities entirely. On a crisp Tuesday morning, I drove directly to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in downtown Denver. I did not walk up to the public reception desk. Through my professional security contacts at Apex Vault, I had secured a private, off-the-books meeting with a senior supervisory special agent running the Cyber and Financial Crimes Division. Sitting in a sterile, windowless interrogation room, I slid a heavy, encrypted titanium flash drive across the cold metal table. "What exactly am I looking at here?" the agent asked, eyeing the small device with deep professional skepticism. "You are looking at a multi-million-dollar interstate Ponzi scheme, severe federal mortgage fraud, and the financial exploitation of over 200 senior citizens," I replied, my voice as hard and unyielding as the drive itself. "The primary perpetrator is my brother. The active co-conspirators are my parents. I am handing you an entire criminal syndicate on a silver platter. Agent, the decryption key is written on the back of the drive. Happy hunting." The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but when they finally lock onto a target, they grind with terrifying precision. Within 2 weeks of my meeting at the regional headquarters, the Federal Bureau of Investigation initiated their preliminary asset containment protocols. They did not kick down doors right away. Instead, they quietly froze 3 of Julian's secondary domestic checking accounts to audit the suspicious offshore wire transfers. It was a subtle, bureaucratic chokehold, but for a man running a desperate Ponzi scheme, it was a massive, blaring siren. Julian and my parents immediately smelled the smoke. Realizing that their flawless facade was rapidly cracking under federal scrutiny, they did not retreat or attempt to make amends. They doubled down. They launched a coordinated, vicious psychological war against me, intending to break my spirit and force me to withdraw the federal complaint before the investigation escalated to criminal indictments. The smear campaign began online, orchestrated primarily by my mother. Margaret took to social media, posting lengthy, tear-soaked videos to her hundreds of followers and our entire extended family. She painted a tragic, heavily distorted picture. She claimed, with absolute, terrifying conviction, that I was suffering from a severe, undiagnosed psychological breakdown. According to her theatrical narrative, My demanding, isolated lifestyle had finally driven me completely insane with jealousy over my brother's brilliant success. She told aunts, uncles, and family friends that I was suffering from intense paranoid delusions, actively fabricating wild financial conspiracies and forging documents just to frame Julian and destroy his beautiful future. My phone became a toxic weapon. I received dozens of voicemails and texts from distant relatives, all dripping with misplaced pity or outright condemnation, urging me to seek psychiatric help and stop torturing my loving parents. It was textbook, predatory gaslighting. They were trying to rewrite reality, isolating me entirely by making sure no one in my personal life would believe a single word I said. When the social media manipulation failed to force my hand, Julian escalated from emotional abuse to outright professional sabotage. He knew exactly where I worked, and he knew how highly regulated the data security industry was. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, three massive, aggressively intimidating men showed up unannounced at the main reception area of Apex Vault Data Security. They refused to identify themselves, loudly demanding to see me and aggressively harassing the front desk staff, causing a massive disruption. Simultaneously, an anonymous, heavily encrypted email was blasted to the entire executive board and the Human Resources Department of Apex Vault. The message contained fabricated, highly damaging allegations claiming that I was using my high-level clearance to illegally harvest and sell sensitive client financial data on the dark web. Julian was attempting to strike at the absolute core of my identity. He wanted me fired, publicly disgraced, and stripped of the very resources I was using to fight him. However, Julian grossly miscalculated the profound loyalty and intelligence of the people I worked with. The executive board at Apex Vault did not build a fortress of cybersecurity by falling for cheap, amateur phishing tactics and baseless smear campaigns. They knew my flawless track record and my uncompromising moral character. Instead of suspending me, the chief executive officer called me into a secure boardroom, handed me a cup of hot coffee, and asked how the company could help. The internal security team immediately sprang into action. They extracted crystal clear, high-definition camera footage of the thugs harassing our lobby and ran facial recognition protocols, identifying two of them as low-level private security contractors with known criminal records. The company lawyers bundled this new footage directly to my federal contacts, adding witness intimidation and corporate harassment to Julian's rapidly expanding criminal profile. Despite the fierce backing of my employer, the physical reality of the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The men lingering near my workplace began parking outside my newly restored home at odd hours of the night. The threat of physical violence was no longer an abstract concept. It was idling in a dark sedan at the end of my driveway. On the firm, non-negotiable advice of my white-collar defense attorney, I had to pack a single suitcase and abandon my sanctuary. Under the cover of total darkness, I relocated to a highly secure, undisclosed safe house arranged by my legal counsel. I changed my phone number, deactivated all my personal social media profiles, and completely, permanently severed every single line of communication with anyone sharing my bloodline. The isolation of that sterile, sparsely furnished apartment was initially suffocating. I spent my nights staring at blank walls, the silence ringing heavily in my ears. I had lost my family, my home, and the basic comfort of physical safety. But inside that cold safe house, I absolutely refused to shatter. Every ounce of grief I felt was violently compressed into pure, unadulterated resolve. I utilized the secure, untraceable network connection provided by the safe house to launch a counteroffensive. I could not speak publicly, but I could act from the shadows. I secretly coded and deployed a completely anonymous, encrypted support forum on the deep web. I used the client ledger I had pulled from Julian's server to discreetly invite the dozens of elderly victims he had defrauded. I provided them with a safe, monitored digital space to share their stories, aggregate their financial losses, and access free, high-level legal resources I sourced through my professional network. I was no longer just fighting for my stolen house. I was actively forging an army of the betrayed, preparing them for the exact moment the federal hammer would finally drop. For 3 agonizingly long months, I remained an absolute ghost hidden inside that sterile, secure apartment. The federal justice machine operates with methodical, often frustrating slowness until the exact second it is completely ready to strike. Then, it moves with the terrifying, unstoppable force of a hurricane. At exactly 5 in the morning on a crisp Thursday, the hammer finally dropped. Julian was wide awake in his luxury downtown penthouse, bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of an expensive ring light. He was actively hosting a massive, highly promoted live stream to over 50,000 dedicated followers. He was aggressively pitching a fraudulent new cryptocurrency token, attempting to quickly siphon even more cash from unsuspecting victims to plug the massive holes in his collapsing empire. He never even heard the heavy tactical boots moving rapidly down his private hallway. The reinforced wooden door of his penthouse did not just open, it was violently breached off its metal hinges by a heavy steel battering ram. Heavily armed federal agents poured into the living room like a tidal wave. Before Julian could even utter a single syllable of protest, he was tackled and slammed face first onto his imported marble floor. Tens of thousands of viewers watched in absolute stunned silence as the self-proclaimed digital real estate visionary was aggressively handcuffed. His terrified, weeping face broadcast live across the globe before a tactical agent abruptly reached out and smashed the camera feed to black. At that exact same second, 20 miles away in the quiet, affluent suburbs, a highly coordinated strike team surrounded my parents' house. There was no polite knocking. Federal agents executed a comprehensive, no-knock search and seizure warrant. They aggressively tore through the perfectly decorated living room, systematically bagging every single laptop, tablet, smartphone, and physical paper document in the house. My father, completely stripped of his usual arrogant bluster, stood paralyzed by the kitchen island in his pajamas, his face pale with absolute terror as agents tore his home office apart. My mother, however, reacted with pure, venomous hysteria. She violently thrashed against the female agent attempting to restrain her, screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. "This is a massive setup," she shrieked, her frantic voice echoing loudly down the quiet suburban street, waking the neighbors. "My cold-blooded daughter did this. She planted those digital files. She is completely insane. You are arresting the wrong people." The seasoned agent simply ignored her manic protests, continuing to methodically dismantle her pristine, carefully constructed life piece by piece. By 8 in the morning, the local Denver television stations had completely exploded. Every single morning broadcast was dominated by the exact same breaking story. The news anchors read the sensational headlines with grim, serious expressions. Prominent social media influencer, arrested in massive, multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme, and the calculated theft of his own biological sister's residential property, Julian's heavily filtered, glamorous social media headshots were violently juxtaposed against brutal, unedited helicopter footage of him being shoved roughly into the back of a dark federal transport van, looking disheveled, pathetic, and completely broken. 48 hours later, Julian appeared before a stern federal magistrate judge for his initial bail hearing. His high-priced defense attorney confidently requested a standard pretrial release, citing his client's supposed lack of a violent criminal history and his deep, established ties to the local business community. But the lead federal prosecutor completely eviscerated that argument in less than 2 minutes. Utilizing the encrypted data packets I had meticulously compiled and handed over, the Bureau had successfully tracked down and raided a secondary, hidden storage locker rented under a fake corporate entity. Inside that locker, investigators found a heavily forged international passport, several physical gold bars, and a fully paid, one-way first-class airline ticket to a country with absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. He had been actively planning to completely abandon his sinking ship, leaving his desperate investors and his own parents to face the massive fallout alone. The judge did not even hesitate. She stared down at my brother with absolute, unmasked disgust and firmly denied bail, immediately remanding him to federal custody as an extreme, undeniable flight risk. I watched the entire legal proceeding unfold via a secured, private remote video link from the heavy silence of my safe house. There were absolutely no tears falling from my eyes. There was no residual pity, no hesitation, and no lingering sorrow for the people who happened to share my genetic code. As the heavy steel doors of the holding cell loudly clanged shut behind my brother on the video feed, I leaned back in my desk chair and exhaled a long, incredibly steady breath. I felt profoundly light. It was the exact, overwhelming sensation of waking up from a highly complex, dangerous surgery and realizing the doctors had successfully and completely removed a massive, malignant tumor from your body. The poison was finally gone. 8 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open to reveal the final act of this nightmare. The trial was a highly publicized spectacle, but inside the mahogany-paneled courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Julian sat at the defense table, completely unrecognizable. The flashy influencer with perfectly styled hair and a designer wardrobe was gone. In his place sat a hollowed-out, deeply terrified man in a loose-fitting orange jumpsuit, staring down the barrel of decades in federal prison for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and running a massive interstate criminal enterprise. As the prosecution methodically laid out the mountain of digital evidence I had provided, Julian realized his high-priced lawyer could not save him. Cornered and desperate, he played his final, absolute, most destructive card. In a pathetic attempt to secure a reduced sentence, Julian threw our own parents directly into the fire. His defense attorney submitted a newly discovered piece of evidence, a secret, covertly recorded audio file from a family meeting that took place long before the fake mortgage was ever signed. The audio played clearly through the courtroom speakers, and the plot twist it delivered shook me to my very core. The voices echoing in the silent room belonged to my father, Thomas, and my mother, Margaret. They were not simply agreeing to Julian's desperate scheme, they had actively engineered it. "We are drowning, Julian," my father's recorded voice hissed with venomous panic. "The bookies are threatening to take the house. We have over $250,000 in gambling debts. You have to use Andrea. She has all that equity just sitting there. We groomed her to be self-sufficient, so she could be our safety net. She is the reserve bank. Take the house, pay off our markers with the kickback, and use the rest to float your investors. It is the only way to save the family name." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. The targeting of my sanctuary was never a sudden, desperate act by a failing brother. It was a cold, calculated conspiracy designed by my own creators exactly 2 years ago. I was never a daughter to them. I was an asset waiting to be completely drained to preserve their pathetic, deceitful country club facade. A heavy, deathly silence blanketed the room as the audio file clicked to an end. My parents sat in the gallery, completely paralyzed, the blood draining entirely from their faces as the entire world finally saw them for the monsters they truly were. The judge turned her gaze toward me, asking if I had a victim impact statement. I did not cry. I did not break down or show a single ounce of sorrow. I stood up tall, walked to the podium, and turned my head to lock eyes with Thomas and Margaret one last time. Any lingering, pathetic shred of mercy I held for the concept of blood ties instantly turned to ash. "Your Honor," I spoke, my voice ringing clear and steady through the massive room. "These people did not just steal money, they attempted to steal my sanity, my career, and my future to cover up their own moral rot. I am asking this court to apply the absolute maximum penalty allowed by federal law for every single person involved. Show them exactly as much mercy as they showed me, which was none." The judge nodded solemnly. When the sentences were finally handed down, the hammer of justice was absolutely merciless. Julian was sentenced to 18 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. But the true vindication came next. The judge immediately revoked my parents' status as mere spectators. Acting on superseding indictments prepared by the prosecution, federal marshals approached the gallery. Thomas and Margaret were ordered to stand, their wrists violently yanked behind their backs and locked in heavy steel handcuffs right there in the middle of the courtroom. They were sentenced to 7 years each as the primary architects and accomplices to the fraud. My mother began to wail, screaming out late, desperate apologies, begging for her little girl to save her, but her pathetic cries were completely silenced by the sharp, definitive crack of the judge's wooden gavel. It was over. Today, I am standing in the center of my sunlit living room. The fraudulent mortgage was completely voided by the courts, and full, uncontested ownership of my historic home was legally restored to me. But the house is no longer an isolated fortress. The living room is filled with genuine warmth, loud laughter, and the clinking of glasses. My closest colleagues from the security team at Apex Vault are here, sharing stories and food. Sitting comfortably on my vintage sofa are 3 of the elderly victims from Julian's scam, wonderful people whom I fought alongside to recover their stolen pensions, now adopted as my honored guests. Looking around at these brilliant, resilient people, I finally understand the ultimate truth. Family is not defined by the people who share your genetic code, especially when those people only view you as an object to be exploited and destroyed. True family consists of the people you actively choose. It is the community that respects your boundaries, celebrates your strength, and stands firmly by your side when the absolute worst storms hit. I built my own sanctuary, and now it is filled with my real family. Thank you so much for listening to today's story on Maya Revenge Stories. We would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments. If you found today's journey compelling, please consider helping us out with just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated team, helping them support their families so we can continue creating and sharing these incredible stories with all of you. Stay safe, and remember to always protect your peace.